What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another strategy series video. We're gonna keep this thing going. We're trying hard to keep this thing at like a relatively regular weekly thing, unless some other video comes up that's more relevant. We're just trying to make sure the content keeps coming. This is the time of year when I think strategy series videos are great. So today, like I said at the end of the last video, today we're talking blocking. It's something that I think is an incredibly underrated skill or underappreciated, something that I think personally that the best players in the game do better. It's just this is just something that separates like the good from the great in my mind, because blocking in Fab is very much a math game. It's a challenge to do correctly, and a lot of it is a knowledge-based thing. It's something that you learn the longer you play, because there's a lot of things that you need to know in order to block correctly. I think that, you know, sometimes when we do these strategy series videos, we try to give our points or our input based on what we know, and that's not always perfect knowledge. However, Nick and I are Guardian players, and I don't think anybody is better at blocking than good Guardian players, especially the two of us who played Guardian during the height of Siege Chain, and both of us went top 64 at Nationals in the US during the peak of Cheerios Briar and took down the body count of Cheerios Briars that we put up was a big number, and we take pride in our blocking skills. So we're going to share our thoughts with you guys, and I think it starts with exactly that. Knowing your matchup. There's nothing in this game that's more important about knowing your matchups than blocking, because it lets you know turn to turn what you can expect from your opponent. They have to really come with a surprise to beat you, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's knowing your matchup also kind of incorporates when we're talking about blocking too, it's important to also think about your equipment and what specifically you want to be using your equipment for. I've seen a lot of players that are newer, less their experience, and they'll throw their equipment just on any vanilla damage, or they'll use it really early on in a matchup where equipment will just always have more value later in the game when your hand is innately being taxed, because a lot of attacks will now have on-hit death. And so you got to block it, whether you want to or not. And having that equipment in those situations just gives you a lot of potential to pivot that late game and take the win. And knowing what you want to be doing with your equipment on a matchup by matchup basis will just help you get the most out of it and give you a lot of consistency as you go throughout the course of a tournament or throughout the course of your playing.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times what people underestimate is the value of matchup knowledge when it comes to blocking. Being able to estimate what your opponent is doing. And for some people, that's really challenging because it does require a lot of interaction with the game. Like that's just the reality of it, is you have to play the game a lot. You have to watch you have to watch the game played a lot. You have to listen to concepts and deck construction. You know, deck techs are good for that. What cards are relevant? You know, I prefer to be a player who knows what everyone else's cards do, because it gives me the ability to anticipate what I can see down the line. Sometimes what'll happen in a matchup, you'll see by not understanding an opponent's play lines, somebody will incorrectly block early and then be punished later in the turn by a hit effect that's far worse than what they would have seen up front. And that's where knowing what your opponent is going to do is really key. And the other half, I think, of knowing the matchup is what you need to do on your half of every turn cycle, so that way you're equally punishing your opponent back and demanding that they can't just play the game. Sometimes people don't realize the value of just being able to swing your weapon. If you have if you're a weapon-based deck with a hit effect, like, you know, the Winter's Wail or, you know, something like that, it's important to understand, like, what do I need to do on my turn to demand that my opponent respond to me as well? Because there is a thing that to consider where you can lose games by simply blocking too much and by not trading some damage. You need to play to end game situations where you are in control, and that requires that you don't just know what your opponent is doing, but you need to know what you need to do on your turn. Like, how do you successfully navigate the game state in a way that allows you to win the game versus just trying to block everything they do.
Right, and I think a good lesson that people learn, or a way they learn this lesson, is playing against like a Katsu player, a Dorinthia player, who you block everything out, you're feeling great, and then you're not presenting anything back, and they just slowly start to set up a turn that is wholly uninteractable.
Yep.
Chain is also, I mean, he's the biggest and baddest of them all when it comes to this. If you don't do something to end the game against some of these decks, they will just eventually be able to build to a situation where they can overpower you. And if your goal is really just to either pressure them enough so that they can't build to that, or keep your life total high enough to where you can weather that overpowering storm and then take them down in the aftermath.
Yeah, and a lot of that is just understanding the key fundamentals of what you're trying to block and how you're trying to block it in a way that lets you maybe take some vanilla damage. That's the thing that I think people don't understand, is like you have to do the math when it comes to blocking. You have to understand what you're giving up and what you're getting in exchange. The problem is some people, when they do the math, they don't do the math on like vanilla versus hit effect damage, and it causes more problems because people will think, oh, if I partially block multiple attacks and I take the same amount of damage, then it's net zero on both of our part. The problem is if you underblock multiple attacks, but you could reorganize those blocks to blocking the attack that actually matters, you come out net positive, even if the life totals change a little more in your opponent's favor. Losing an extra 2 life to overblock a Whelming Gust Wave for Katsu, like letting them have a Surging Strike, but 2-card blocking to block for 6 on a red Whelming Gust Wave that's coming in for 4, just to guarantee that they don't Breaking Scales Ancestral end the game on you and have a turn that turns into a blowout where you go, I'll block part on this and I'll block part on that. Another trade that drives me crazy, and this is just something that I've seen far too often in ProQuest, and it could just be the fact that not enough people have played Guardian, but Fates and Sync start to come into decks, and people will, it's Autumn's Touch, 9, Dominate, go again. And they go, okay, Fate. The Fate for Scene, I'll opt. And then the Bravo player goes, Icy Winter's Wail, and they go, I'll block 3, I'll take 1. And it's like, if you just, it seems like a really simple idea, but people in the moment will often think, I have 9 coming in, I need to block as much of it as possible. But if you're aware of the math of the turn and you go, look, if I block 4 of 4 and 3 of 9, it's the same as blocking 4 of 9 and 3 of 4. Like, I'm going to end up with the same amount of damage. The difference is I'm not going to be hit by a negative hit effect that will turn my turn into a worse turn.
Definitely. And I think kind of the general heuristic we both use when we're approaching how we block is whenever you draw up, it's important to identify how this hand can block and know like what cards you need to be using first and then go into blocking. Especially when you're playing, if you're trying to transition into a Guardian deck or a longer style deck and you kind of block willy-nilly, you could suddenly find yourself lost without threats. Maybe you blocked with all your Oakenolds and you blocked with 2 of them and you weren't quite able to line up the fuse on that last one. That can really be the difference maker. So it's important to identify what cards you're blocking with from your own hand and knowing is this a card I can block with or is it not? And what situations might turn a card that I think is too valuable to block with into something I just have to put on the chain.
Right.
What are those hit effects that are just too important and you have to cover up? And when you're able to identify those and have a plan for how you might interact with them, like you had talked about that Whelming Gust Wave, maybe you'll save that 2-block equipment so you can always have that to throw in front of the Whelming Gust Wave and give yourself that extra insulation from the breaking scales and get to that 5 break point.
Yep. It's important to understand too, like as the game goes on, that realistically, right, card block value and the value of the card itself is effectively like a modal thing. turn by turn and game state by game state, it changes. It's something that has a lot of impact on the game, because early game in some matchups you might go, man, I'm playing Starvo, I want to awakening into a pulverize, that's going to be my catch up mechanic. But realizing that at some point there's the potential to just, if you're ahead by 12 life, the amount of damage you would have to take in order for that play to be of value becomes so poor that you just go, you know what, from now on, if I see an awakening or if I see a pulverize, that's the first card that I block with, because the opportunity for me to play that card is 0 to none. Versus in other matchups, the other thing is how valuable a card is in a given matchup. Like Nick said, it's not just like a card's damage output, but what it does to a matchup. Into a ninja, for example, Spinal Crush is god tier if you're playing a Guardian, right. And vice versa. If you're a ninja player and you're playing into a Guardian, you have to evaluate that you have to maintain certain combo line threats in your deck, because if you don't maintain that consistency of, I need every card in this line to present a hit effect so I can get one of them to go through because they are capable of defending me out almost entirely on a turn. Like, those things have to stay together, and you have to be aware of those things in your deck, because what that does is puts opponents in a place where you need to be, which is you have to be aware of hit effects and combat tricks. Like, that's something that's very powerful in this game, is that you need to know what the hit effects are, but then the combat tricks is like the back end of that one. What are the reactions that they could play? What are the instants that they could play? Sometimes people don't think about that because it makes more sense sometimes in a chain deck or in, a Viscerai deck or in a ninja deck or in whoever wants to run Art of War. You go, well, they're going to do it first so they can get the go again. But if they have access to a go again naturally, it's entirely possible that they will wait until after that first attack goes to then play the Art of War to give the +1 to the current attack to drive home an effect and a hit effect. You have to be aware that those cards are in the deck, just like razors and pummels. You don't, nothing feels worse than that first time you're playing Flesh and Blood and you're like, oh yeah, I totally blocked this hit effect, and they go razor. You're just like, right. Oh no. It's devastating.
Right. Attack reactions are definitely cards that when you first start playing, I mean, every new player has been absolutely trounced by a Dorinthia.
Yes.
Everybody.
Yep.
Because she is, and you hear us talking a lot about Dorinthia, a lot about Katsu. It's because those two decks in particular are they just pummel new players that aren't experienced with how to block them specifically, because they just present so many different hit effects, or they have so much they can do after you declare your blocks. And understanding, what they might have in their hand is a huge importance when it comes to blocking, especially when you're in these decks that might be playing attack reactions. When you can put them on a pummel in hand, you can put them on that Razor Reflex. There's a lot of times where you can take the value out of that card outright, and or bait them into using it, hitting it with that sink blow so that you can negate the effect from it. And there's also important to keep in mind that it is nice to know when you can let these cards come through. Sometimes the answer is, I might just have to let them pummel me here, because the alternative of them just arsenaling it and recycling the situation next turn is not worth it. Yep. We've seen this happen many times in late game Bravo mirrors, where people are coming in for a hammer, and your opponent is so afraid of the pummel, they're overblocking on the hammer, and then eventually that pummel gets combined with a crippling crush or something that they can't just overblock on. So it's important to also know when you're blocking. Sometimes you got to bite the bullet and take the hit on these attack reactions here, because you know what the damage is going to be. Always take the devil over the devil you don't, because if you let them arsenal that and build to it, they can really potentially punish you in the end.
Yeah. And a lot of it is, I think, the last principle we're going to talk about, which is the idea of damage trading and what you're getting out of what you're taking. And a huge key in blocking is, unless there is massive incentive behind it, or you almost never want to trade negative. You can't trade negative. I've too many times you watch a new player perceive that they have a really good turn coming, and they are willing to take too much damage to then output not enough damage in return because they're not aware of those combat tricks. People will go, you know what? I'm just going to take everything you've got. They take 15 and then they end up dealing 8. And it's like, look, you just went 7 negative because you didn't anticipate what was actually coming from their offensive turn, or you didn't understand what they could do defensively on the next turn. That's something that, again, can be the most punishing when you play into a Katsu deck, a ninja in general, where you let them give you 10 damage because in your hand you're going, well, I'm going to come in for 5 and then I'm going to come in for another 5 and then I'm going to swing my weapon. But then you just don't take into account flick flag. Like some people don't, they go, well, if they defense reaction me, I'll still get one through. And it's like, right. But the long-term negative impact on your turn that one flick flack can have can't be underestimated because they flick flack your first 5, then they 1 card block your next 5, then they take your weapon. You traded massively negative and they're still going to have a turn coming back at you. And those are that's the kind of math that you have to do when blocking that comes from understanding your opponent's matchup and just going, look, I can't absorb 20 to deal 10. That's just bad math on all accounts, and you don't win games by doing that.
No, not at all. And I think it's we talked a lot at the beginning about specifically blocking from more of a defensive mindset, a control mindset. It's important to know, like you're saying there, when you need to block in those aggro matchups and how you can play around your opponent's defense. If you're in an aggro matchup and you let your opponent continually get full value out of their flick flacks and they can 2-card block for 9, that's suddenly a lot of tempo that they gain in that aggro matchup. Whereas if you can find ways to sequence your offensive turn around their potential blocking, around that flick flack, it can gain you a lot of value in the end. And also knowing in those aggro matchups, when do I need to commit cards from hand? What are those hit effects again that I need to cover up so that my opponent can't blow me out with their biggest turn?
Yep.
Oftentimes we saw in like Cheerios Briar, they don't block very much, but when they do, they know exactly, the successful players do, this is the hit effect in the mirror that I need to take away. This is the time I need to commit a card from hand so that you're still able to, you're getting the most value out of that block. You're taking away the most aggressive potential from them while still being able to push back in that tempo matchup.
Yeah, and good blocking when it comes down to it is when knowing how to block. A huge part of it is knowing what to block when and how not to get beat by your opponent outsmarting you with their aggression. A lot of times what people will miss is that you'll just fire off a defense reaction on the first thing and then they'll punish you with something later that hits a different break point that is just it's a poor decision to block the first thing. If you know something worse is coming, make them play into your blocks. That's something that not enough people do. I think that's how you start to gain as a new player. That's the first time you ever feel like you gain ground on Dorinthia is when you bait a Dorinthia player by giving them like 1 card from hand to get them to go, now I've got him. They screwed up this time, and they hit you with a reaction. You're like, but I have you right where I want you. And you hit them with the sink below, and they're like, oh, that's okay. I have another reaction. You're like, but that's okay. In my arsenal, my other defense reaction. And you just hard reset their Dawn Blade, put all of their counters away. They just blew through like 2 of their best reactions. And now you go, so is this, do I win now? Is this how I win? And I think that's like such a huge tempo swing in people's game is learning how to block efficiently by evaluating and understanding your opponent's turns, because what their cards do and what your cards do in return is value that you have to look at while you're blocking and going into your own turn.
Mm-hmm. And that oftentimes that just takes experience. It takes practice, and it takes being punished.
Yeah,
you're gonna be hit with something 1,000 times before you figure out how to actually block it and interact with it, and that's just all part of the process. And I especially think it takes a lot of time on control decks. If you're learning to play control decks, you're learning to play a more reactive style. Give yourself that time to learn and adapt, because like you always say, you can't answer the problem if you don't know the question.
Yep.
And so you have to take time to learn all the different questions that you need to answer and then figure out how you can go about answering those.
Yep.
And that's really where you're gonna, when things start to come together and things start to click, is when you'll start to get a lot of value on control decks.
Exactly. Make sure that you guys are willing to take a punch in the face. You know, sometimes you don't learn how to defend yourself and take a couple. So if you got a buddy who plays Katsu or Dorinthia and they're punishing you relentlessly, just take some of these. You know, take a couple of these principles, try to apply them, take notes after you get done, and then just say go again. Just keep going back into it. Be willing to take the beating sometimes, because that's how you get better and that's how you learn to grow. So thank you guys again for hanging out with us. Nick, thanks again for joining me as always on our strategy series. And we'll be back next time with more strategy series videos.
Oh yeah. Until next time, y'all.